I want each of you to marry rich, powerful men. Men who will give you everything you could ever want so you never suffer like I have." There was silence in the room. Julie's eyes widened in shock as she listened to her mother's words. She felt her heart sink. "Mama," she began carefully, "marriage is not about money. It's about love, understanding, and respect." Once upon a time, in a small village in Nigeria, there was a family full of love and laughter. Victoria and her husband, Paul, had built a humble but happy home with their 3 daughters, Julie, Annabel, and Jessica. Though they weren't rich, they had each other, and that was enough. Paul worked hard to provide for his family, teaching his daughters the values of kindness, honesty, and hard work. Every evening, they would sit together, telling stories, laughing, and dreaming about the future. One sunny morning, Paul announced that he would take his family on a special trip to visit his hometown. The daughters were thrilled. They had always wanted to see where their father grew up. They packed their bags with excitement, chattering away as they piled into the family car. As they drove, Victoria looked at her husband and children, her heart full of gratitude for the simple, happy life they had built together. But their joy was cut short that very night. As they traveled down a narrow, winding road, a car suddenly appeared, swerving recklessly into their lane. Paul tried to avoid it, but it was too late. Their car collided with the other vehicle, and everything went black. When Victoria woke up in the hospital, her head throbbing and her body bruised, she looked around frantically. Her daughters were there, shaken but safe. But her husband, her beloved partner in life, was gone. Paul had not survived the accident, and their family was forever changed in that single, tragic moment. After the funeral, Victoria was left with her 3 daughters and had no idea how they would survive without Paul. Her husband's family, his brothers and sisters, came to visit, and at first, Victoria hoped they would help her. But she soon discovered that they only cared about what Paul had left behind. One afternoon, while the daughters played outside, Paul's siblings arrived at their house with anger in their eyes. They pushed their way into the house, declaring that Victoria and her daughters had no right to stay there anymore. "You and your children must leave at once," shouted one of the uncles, his voice filled with spite. "This house, the land, everything belongs to us now." Victoria pleaded with them, tears streaming down her face. She explained that she had nowhere else to go, that her daughters needed a roof over their heads, food to eat, a chance at a future. But her words fell on deaf ears. The uncle sneered, telling her that she and her daughters were now strangers in their own home. With no choice, Victoria and her daughters packed up what little they could carry. They left a house that had been filled with love and warmth, now reduced to a cold memory. They looked back at the home one last time, tears flowing as they walked away with heavy hearts. From that day on, life became a constant struggle for Victoria and her daughters. With no money, no home, and no support, they were forced to wander, staying wherever they could find shelter. Victoria worked tirelessly, taking on any job she could find, cleaning, washing clothes, even carrying heavy loads in the market. But it was never enough. They often went to bed hungry, cold, and frightened of what the future held. Julie, the eldest, took on a motherly role, helping her siblings and comforting them when Victoria was too exhausted to speak. Annabel, the second daughter, grew tougher and more silent, her mind filled with resentment and bitterness toward the family who had abandoned them. Jessica, the youngest, clung to her mother's side, too young to fully understand the hardships but old enough to sense the emptiness and sadness around her. One quiet evening, Victoria was at her small market stall, arranging vegetables under the dimming sky. She barely noticed when an elegant woman in a bright-colored dress approached her. Victoria looked up and recognized Gladys, an old friend from years back when things were different. Before she could say anything, Gladys smiled and handed her a glimmering gold envelope. "Victoria, it's an invitation," Gladys said, smiling warmly. "It's for the wedding of my niece. Everyone will be there." Victoria hesitated, her heart sinking as she looked at the invitation. She hadn't been to any social gathering in years. Since her husband's passing, she had lost touch with that part of her life. She was just focused on surviving with her daughters. "Thank you, Gladys," Victoria said, "but I'm not sure I can attend. Things have changed. I'm not the same person I used to be." Gladys placed her hand on Victoria's shoulder with a sympathetic look. "Oh, don't be silly, Victoria. We all understand what you've been through. You're still part of us, and you must come. Besides," she added with a gentle nudge, "who knows? Maybe it will be a chance for your girls to meet the right people. Don't let this opportunity pass you by." The mention of her daughters made Victoria pause. She thought about her girls, her struggle to give them a better life, to keep them safe from poverty. Maybe Gladys was right. Maybe this would be a small step toward changing their fortunes. So, against her better judgment, Victoria agreed. She thanked Gladys, held the invitation tightly, and told herself this was the right thing to do. The day of the wedding arrived, and Victoria dressed herself in her old lace dress, faded but clean. She couldn't afford anything new, but she hoped no one would pay much attention. She reminded herself to hold her head high and went alone, wanting to shield her daughters from any harsh remarks. But the moment she entered the wedding hall, a wave of murmurs washed over her. People's eyes followed her, not with warmth but with amusement and disdain. Victoria kept her gaze down, moving to the back of the hall, but the whispers grew louder, echoing around her. "Look at her, in that old dress. She really has fallen low, hasn't she?" someone murmured behind her. Another voice chimed in, "I heard she's been selling vegetables in the market." Imagine that. The once respected wife of a man like her late husband, now struggling just to make ends meet. Victoria's heart pounded as she forced herself to ignore the remarks, hoping they would die down. But they didn't. Then, Mrs. Stella, a family friend, walked over with a cruel smile. "Victoria, dear, you're here," she said loudly, drawing the attention of more guests. "I almost didn't recognize you. Times have really changed, haven't they? How are you managing?" Victoria tried to keep her composure, giving a faint smile. "By God's grace, we're getting by." But Mrs. Stella's words turned even sharper. "Getting by, you say? With 3 daughters and no father around?" Her voice grew louder, as if for everyone to hear. "Tell me, how did your husband really die? Some say it wasn't an accident at all." She leaned in closer, her voice dripping with malice. "Some say you had something to do with it." The color drained from Victoria's face, and she felt her legs weaken. She wanted to defend herself, but Mrs. Stella's words cut deeper than she could bear. She looked around, hoping for someone, anyone, to defend her, but all she saw were eyes full of judgment and disbelief. Another woman nearby snickered. "Well, what can you expect? Her own husband's family threw her out of the house. If they thought she was innocent, they would have kept her, wouldn't they?" Victoria's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay silent, hoping the insults would stop. But they only got worse. Mrs. Stella gave a mocking laugh. "You know, Victoria, you used to have everything. Now look at you, selling vegetables in the market, dressed like a pauper. And you think you can come here and rub shoulders with us? Who invited you here, anyway?" Gladys, who had once called Victoria her friend, turned her face away, pretending she didn't see the humiliation her invitation had caused. Victoria realized then that even the invitation had been a trap, a way to remind her of what she no longer had. As the crowd grew bolder, people muttered cruel words, each one piercing her heart. Poor Victoria. Her daughters will end up just like her, struggling, desperate, and forgotten. She better leave before she embarrasses herself even more. Finally, unable to take any more, Victoria turned and hurried out of the hall. Once she was outside, she leaned against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Her heart ached with humiliation and pain. All she had wanted was a chance, just one small chance for her daughters to see a life beyond hardship. Instead, she had become the object of scorn. As the laughter and whispers faded behind her, Victoria wiped her tears, her heart hardening with each breath. She made a vow then and there. She would never let anyone look down on her or her daughters again. She would do whatever it took, sacrifice whatever she had to, so that her daughters would marry wealthy men and live in comfort. She would make sure they never knew the kind of pain she felt in that moment. As Victoria left the wedding hall, her heart felt as heavy as a rock. She could still hear the laughter, see the people pointing, and feel their stares. Their cruel words were like sharp stones, each one hurting her deeply. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she could barely see where she was going. Victoria was lost in her own thoughts, feeling broken and alone. She didn't notice that she had walked right into the street. Just then, a car came speeding around the corner. The driver honked loudly, screeching to a stop just inches from her. The loud sound snapped Victoria out of her thoughts. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with shock. She felt the rush of air as the car stopped so close. Her heart was pounding fast, and she could barely breathe. The driver rolled down his window and shouted angrily, "What's wrong with you, woman? Are you trying to get yourself killed? Can't you watch where you're going?" Victoria couldn't speak. She just stood there, frozen. Her hands were shaking, and she held onto a nearby lamppost to steady herself. People on the street began to stop and stare. They whispered to each other, some with pity, some with confusion. "Poor woman," one of them said quietly. "She looks so lost. She's probably been through something hard," another murmured, glancing at her with a sad look. Their words made Victoria feel even more ashamed. She could feel her face burning as she realized people were watching her. She felt small and helpless, like all her struggles were laid bare for everyone to see. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Victoria wiped her tears. She lifted her head, trying to gather her strength, and forced herself to keep walking. Her heart was still racing, and her legs felt weak, but she kept moving forward, away from the wedding and the pain. As she walked, the streetlights seemed cold and unfriendly. Shadows stretched across the road, making everything feel dark and lonely. But she pushed on, not looking back, trying to find some small bit of strength left in her tired heart. When Victoria finally got home, it was late. The small, dim room felt cold and empty, but she was too tired to care. She closed the door softly, trying not to wake her daughters, who were already asleep on their thin mattresses on the floor. As Victoria sat down, she felt all her strength leave her. She buried her face in her hands, and the tears she had held back all evening finally fell. She thought about the cruel things people had said at the wedding, the insults, and the laughter. It was like every painful word was echoing in her head, and she couldn't stop hearing them. Suddenly, her oldest daughter, Julie, stirred. Even in the dark, Julie could hear her mother's soft sobs. She sat up, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Mama, are you crying?" Victoria quickly wiped her tears and tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, my child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mama is just tired. Go back to sleep." But Julie didn't move. She looked at her mother with worried eyes, sensing that something was very wrong. "Mama, did something bad happen? You've been sad a lot lately." Victoria sighed, feeling the weight of her daughter's question. She wanted to protect her children from the hurt and shame she felt, but she was so tired of hiding it. She pulled Julie close, hugging her tightly, as if her daughter's warmth could melt away her pain. "I'm just so tired of people looking down on us, Julie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They think we are nothing because we have no money. They laugh at me, they laugh at us, like we don't belong anywhere." Julie hugged her mother back, not knowing what to say. Victoria's other daughters, Annabel and Jessica, stirred as well, waking up from the sounds of their mother's quiet sobs. "What's wrong, Mama?" Annabel asked sleepily, her little face full of concern. Victoria looked at her three daughters, feeling a mix of love and sadness. She had worked so hard to give them a good life, but it never seemed to be enough. They had lost everything when their father passed, and now they were all they had left of each other. "I want you girls to have a good life," Victoria whispered, her voice barely a breath. "A life where no one looks down on you or laughs at you. I want you to marry good, rich men who will take care of you, so you never have to feel this kind of shame." Her daughters were silent, not fully understanding the weight of their mother's words, but feeling the sadness behind them. Victoria looked at them, her heart aching with a fierce love. She promised herself, right then and there, that she would do whatever it took to lift her family out of this pain, no matter what it cost. That night, as her daughters drifted back to sleep, Victoria stayed awake, staring into the darkness, her mind full of plans and dreams to never feel that kind of shame again. After the terrible wedding incident, something changed in Victoria. She couldn't sleep most nights, lying awake, replaying the laughter and cruel words she heard. The shame and anger felt like heavy stones pressing on her heart. She told herself that her daughters would never live in shame and poverty, that they would rise above the life she had endured. But in her mind, she believed the only way for them to be respected was to marry rich, powerful men. One night, after the family had finished dinner, Victoria cleared her throat, calling her daughters close. "Julie, Annabel, Jessica," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to talk to you about something very important." The three daughters looked at her curiously. Julie, the eldest, had always seen her mother as a strong woman, but now there was a hard look in her mother's eyes that made her uneasy. Victoria took a deep breath. "My daughters," she began, "you are all beautiful, smart young women. But this world respects only those who have money and power. Without it, people will mock you, treat you like nothing." Her voice grew sharper as she remembered how she was insulted at the wedding. "I want each of you to marry rich, powerful men. Men who will give you everything you could ever want so you never suffer like I have." There was silence in the room. Julie's eyes widened in shock as she listened to her mother's words. She felt her heart sink. "Mama," she began carefully, "marriage is not about money. It's about love, understanding, and respect." Victoria looked at Julie, her face hardening. "Love," she scoffed. "Can love feed you when you're hungry? Can it protect you from insults and shame? Julie, look at me. All my life, I believed in hard work, honesty, and what do I have to show for it? Nothing. But if you marry well, you'll have a secure future. People will respect you." Julie shook her head slowly. "But Mama, if you marry someone only for money, how can you ever be happy? How can you trust that person if there's no love?" Annabel, the second daughter, interrupted, rolling her eyes at Julie. "Mama is right, Julie. Love won't buy you a house or beautiful clothes. Love can't give you a life of comfort." I agree with Mama. I don't care about love if I can have a life that's rich and comfortable. I promise, Mama, I won't disappoint you." Victoria smiled, feeling a wave of pride and relief. "That's my girl, Annabel. You understand." Jessica, the youngest, had been quietly listening to the conversation, watching the argument go back and forth between her mother and her sisters. She looked from Julie to Annabel, unsure of what to think. A small part of her felt excited at the idea of marrying someone rich. But another part of her felt confused. She just sat silently, watching her family argue. Julie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her mother. "Mama," she said softly, "you raised us to value kindness, honesty, and respect. Why would you want us to change now? I want a husband who loves me, someone I can love back. Money alone can't buy happiness." Victoria shook her head firmly. "Julie, you're too naive. You don't know how hard this life can be. I just want you girls to be safe and respected. To live the kind of life I never had." Julie sighed deeply, feeling the heavy weight of her mother's expectations pressing down on her. But she couldn't argue anymore. She could see that her mother's mind was made up. Victoria looked at each of her daughters, her gaze firm and unyielding. "I will not watch my daughters live in poverty and shame. You will marry well, or I will have no peace." With that, she got up and left the room, leaving her daughters in silence. As Victoria left the room, Julie, Annabel, and Jessica sat quietly, the silence heavy between them. Julie's heart was heavy with worry. She couldn't understand why their mother had changed so much, why she cared only about money now. She looked at Annabel, who had a proud, satisfied smile on her face, while Jessica looked unsure, lost in thought. From that night, everything changed. Annabel took her mother's words to heart more than anyone. She started coming and going as she pleased, often leaving the house for days at a time. She would return with expensive gifts, bags of money, and a smug smile on her face. Victoria never questioned her, so long as the money kept coming. It didn't matter to her where Annabel had been or who she was with. All that mattered was that her daughter was bringing in wealth. But Julie grew more worried by the day. She couldn't ignore the signs, the late-night outings, the flashy clothes, the expensive perfumes, and the unfamiliar men Annabel was spending time with. She tried to talk to her mother, hoping to make her understand the dangers of Annabel's behavior. "Mama, please talk to Annabel," Julie pleaded one evening, her voice filled with desperation. "She's putting herself at risk, going out with married men, causing trouble in other people's lives. Everyone in the market is talking about us. They say we are a shame to this family." But Victoria only shrugged, her gaze fixated on the new jewelry Annabel had brought home. "Julie, you're just jealous because you don't know how to get anything for yourself," she replied dismissively. "Look at Annabel. She's doing what she needs to do to help us. You could learn a thing or two from her." The words hit Julie like a slap in the face. She felt her heart break as her own mother, the woman who had once taught her about kindness and integrity, now praised her sister's reckless choices over her own honest efforts. Tears filled her eyes, but she held back, knowing her mother wouldn't understand. Annabel, overhearing their conversation, sneered. "You're just bitter, Julie, because you never have anything worthwhile. You're so busy judging everyone, and yet you're the one who has nothing." The words stung, each one like a knife. Julie's heart twisted with a mix of anger and sadness, feeling like a stranger in her own family. She couldn't understand why her mother and sister were so willing to abandon everything they had once believed in.